So welcome to Stop 8. This is the Guildhall Shopping Centre, which is located in between Queen Street and High Street. And this is one of the city's main retail spaces. As you can see behind me, it's undergoing some quite significant developments. There's going to be 17 new restaurants and eating places which were traditionally, shops such as Poundland, W.H. Smith and so on. So the developers making sure it's going through quite a change at the moment in an attempt to upgrade the shopping centre. But this wasn't traditionally a retail space. In fact, most of the area that we're in now, such as Goldsmith Street, which was one of the traditional streets that transected this area, was actually a residential area, and it kind of dates from medieval times. Now, the question is why has it changed its use from medieval kind of very narrow streets, small-scale residential area to a very large commercial space? Well, to answer that question, interestingly enough, we don't go back to World War II, which is when much of the city, as Ewan has just said, was destroyed and then was rebuilt, and even areas that weren't completely destroyed were actually cleared away and new retail, commercial and residential spaces were constructed. Actually, this particular area of the city, in between the High Street, Queen Street and North Street, wasn't particularly badly damaged in the bombing. But the city faced a real problem, and this is something that's covered in the lectures that we explore on the kind of changing face of Exeter, particularly focusing on human geography, where we begin to think about what happened to the city after World War II, which was essentially a depopulation. Most of the city's residential spaces were built on the periphery. It was assumed through the plan of Thomas Sharp that most people would access the city's services through private motor transport or buses or a few train links that still came into the city centre. So, as people began to live outside of the city centre, cheap land became available to construct retail parks which had free parking, and for the majority of people it offered a much better retail experience. Meanwhile, the city's retail culture began to die. Very few people came into the city centre to do their shopping, and so essentially you see, as you did across much of the United Kingdom, a decline in the city centre as a viable living space. The first attempt in Exeter to try and deal with that issue was where we're standing here at the moment, the Guildhall Shopping Centre. This was an attempt to create a whole new retail experience. Ewan's just panned around to my right here and has shown you something of the Guildhall Shopping Centre. This is a classic late 1970s, early 1980s retail space. It is largely covered in nature, so most of the retail outlets are accessed through covered walkways. It's fairly dark, the architecture is not particularly appealing and attractive. You can see concrete pillars, red brick and so on, relatively low ceilings, not much natural light. And what this means is that today we don't think this is a particularly nice retail space, but at the time, as Ewan said at Stop 7, the values of people at the time are kind of reflected in this retail space. So what the developers decided to do in the late 1970s and early 1980s was to have this partially covered retail space, but crucially they recognised that if you were going to get people to come in and use the shops that they were developing here, you had to provide them with car parking, and cheap car parking at that. And so attendant to the Guildhall Shopping Centre are two very large multi-storey car parks. Now, it's arguably the case that the construction of those car parks probably did more to damage this part of the city than the development of the shopping centre. All of it necessitated the destruction of large numbers of buildings, many of which were taken from the medieval period. And so you have little precincts of streets, such as the eastern end of North Street, Paul Street, which had to be completely demolished to make way for the shopping centre and the car parks. Now, in many people's eyes, particularly when we think of the car parks, this has created a really dead space. So Paul Street used to be a really fantastically vibrant street with shops and other outlets, along with the city's bus station. That's all now been completely wiped away. Interestingly enough, if you go up to Princess Hay, there is a very different philosophy that has underpinned the development of that retail space, which is actually to say we need to promote pedestrianisation, we need to promote dwelling, we need to promote diversity in the retail experience. The Guildhall, as I say, was the very first attempt to regenerate city centres, and it was most definitely a car-based development. Now, what has happened since then is, of course, that the opening of Princess Hay 2, which was finally opened as a whole in September 2007, has meant that all of the high-end shops, as you might call them, have moved towards that part of the city centre, and that has left, to a large extent, the Guildhall a little bit bereft. Many empty retail outlets, many other outlets struggling. Hence, as I started this section of the film with, the need for the developer to redevelop. And the way they've chosen to do that is to bring in a lot of food outlets as a way of getting people to not only come and shop here, but crucially to dwell here. So the plan is, behind where I'm standing, behind St Pancras Church, which is an ancient church building which will be, the area around it will be very much developed. But beyond that, there will be a new public square which integrates the architectural features of the higher market, which we referred to when we were outside Northern Hay Gardens. So when you're undertaking the exercise here, and when you're undertaking the sketch, the one thing I would encourage you to do is not to draw what you think is the most obvious thing, but actually think about how people are using this space. What are the challenges of this space? What things in this space do you think are dysfunctional, that don't work? Why do you think the developer is seeking to try and change it? What are they trying to encourage people to do in their use of the space? So it might be that you don't draw St Pancras Church, or you don't draw the colonnades of the higher market, but actually you might focus on what people are doing, or you might focus on a piece of modern architecture that you think has a particular characteristic.